Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. So today's show is dedicated to really, I would guess, our core listenership, which is Gen X, and we're going to explore what is Gen X comedy. Uh, we're going to just kind of take an overview through its history from the beginning to where it is today to maybe where it'll end up in the future. But before we do that, as always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment, especially on this show, because one of the reasons why we're doing this show is because we know we have so many Gen X listeners, and our Gen X episodes tend to do really well. So if you're a millennial or you're a Gen Y person, you're like, you guys do too many Gen X things. Or if you're a boomer, well, I don't care if you're, no, I do care if you're a boomer. We love everybody. I'm just saying, comments, your conversation with us will always help us know what kind of show we should be doing. Randall, what's a good way to talk to us and say, Chris really rambles on too much?
Well, first of all, just check out our website, chrisandrandall.com. And there's various ways to watch our show, contact us there. Go to our Facebook page, Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall, and there's some discussion on there. You can Facebook us.
Yeah, we really want to hear it. And again, just to be really clear, this is more like an overview show where we're going to touch on a lot of stuff, but we're not going to do a deep dive into anything in particular. We'll probably come back and do several deep dives on, say, Gen X comedy movies or Gen X TV shows or Gen X stand-up. This is more just kind of like a primer on like, hey, what is so distinctive about Gen X and their sense of humor? But before we get into it, Randall, can you tell us who is or what is Generation X?
Yeah, let's talk about it. I have a graph that I'm going to pull up. Tell me when you see it, Chris. There, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so you can definitely see the baby boom in this graph. This is the crude birth rate in the United States from 1800 to 2020, and you can see like women. This is like how many babies per 1,000 people, how many babies each woman has essentially, and you can see like in the 1800s, women had a lot of babies, and then it goes down, 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 down through the Great Depression, down, down, down. 1940, it's at its lowest point. It's a very low point, and then World War II, 1945, World War II ends, and a bunch of people start having a lot of babies. You can see the bump right there in the graph. That's the baby
Yes.
boom. And so by the time you get to around 1965,
Yeah.
it's petering out. Looks like by 19, definitely by 19, I want to say by 1970, definitely 1975, the year I was born, and Chris was born in 65. Definitely the year I was born, it's like over. You can see right here, it's back to normal in 1975. And then it just continues on its trajectory. So who is Gen X? Well, we know who the baby boom are because they're people who were born right after World War II, and you can see they're part of this huge increase in births that people in the United States had. All around the world, people had a lot of babies right after World War II. So Gen X are the people born after this huge boom in births. So we're like the forgotten generation. Nobody cares about us, Chris. When we were growing up, all the businesses, all the companies, they would market everything to boomers. All the entire U.S. culture was all about the
No,
baby boom
we'll
generation.
definitely get to that in a moment, but just for the sake of those who are just trying to fathom it out, would you say, at least for the sake of this show, everyone born after May 8th, 1965, because that's 20 years after World War II, to like, let's say, what, 1985? We call
Yeah.
those that 20-year gap?
Yeah, so things get fuzzy, trying because the baby boom generation is easy to peg because they're all born after World War II, right after World War II, and so who are the generations after that? So it gets fuzzier, but let's say you extrapolate out from the boom that ended around when Chris was born in 1965, 1970, extrapolate out 20 years. So what is that? 1985 to 1990. So if you were born 85 to 90, your parents were some of the last baby boomers. So you're in the next generation, okay? So Gen X is kind of like this generation that's sandwiched in between the baby boomers and the baby boomers' kids.
All right, that would be the millennials, and then our kids would be the Gen Zers. Okay, so that gives you kind of a rough idea. Now, we're not, I know it was Neil Howe and Bob Strauss who coined the term Gen X, and Doug Coupland who titled his book Generation X. So that term has been around really since, like, I'd say 1992. But anyway, now we're getting way too far.
Well, could I just talk about Copeland's book and how he named it?
Sure, and then we're going to move on. But absolutely, go for it, man.
But yeah, the thing about Copeland is, like I was saying, Gen X is like completely overshadowed by the baby boomers. No one gives a crap about Gen X ever. And so Douglas Coupland, I remember when the book came out, Chris. Douglas Coupland wrote this book called Generation X. Wasn't it about computer programmers working on mic? No, that was a different book.
You're thinking about the next book you'd write.
Right.
I actually own a copy of Generation X.
What was Gen X about?
It's just really a series of stories based on people in their 20s, based somewhat on real people and their lives. It's an unreadable piece of crap. And I don't want to get into it too much. I have it. I'll keep it forever. But if you want me to say, hey, man, it changed my life, I'd be lying.
Well, Copeland was one of the first people to try to put his finger on this generation after the baby boomers who no one cared about. And he called them Gen X because he thought that would be a great name for a generation of people no one cares about.
Right. No, and it's great. And he coined a sensibility, and I give him a lot of credit.
But I want to add, Chris, that's important because he was just an independent author who made up a term for a book. And these other generations are named by marketers, essentially. Okay, the baby boom, that's marketing people. I mean, zillennials, millennials. I mean, it's marketers that come up with these terms because, like, these are generations that appeal to marketers and employers. Okay, Gen X has no appeal for anybody.
Okay, well, we're definitely going to get into everything Randall is saying in just a minute, but you got to let me get into the point of the show. But thank you for that very helpful explanation of what Generation X is and is not, man. Because what it is not, as you like to point out, is certainly that's absolutely the case. So we're going to get back to what you said in a second, but we're talking about comedy. So just like two things I really want you guys who are listening and watching and Randall to keep in your head is that every single generation has its own unique, distinct brand of humor. That's just kind of like every intergeneration has its distinct sensibility. I mean, every generation of painters have their own painting style. We just did a very long piece on that. Every generation of writers, even of songwriters, poets, every generation has a marked sensibility. And in comedy, whether it's stand-up or TV or novels, it doesn't really matter. Good comedy is normally about reflecting where you are in your life at the time that you're in it. So what I'm also trying to say is the other element you've got to understand is that each time in your life has its own sense of humor. There really is something called young person humor. There really is something called middle-aged humor. There really is something called old person humor. Right now, no matter where you are on the paradigm, you can close the stuff and just bring it back to me and you. But right now, no matter where you are on the paradigm, can you close thanks. Wherever you are on the paradigm, between 1965 and 1985, you're middle-aged. So that's where you are today. So I just want to first talk about our influences, because our sensibility is shaped always by what were the influences. So I went on to all the various Gen X groups that I belong to, and I asked these questions, which is, what is distinctive about our humor? What makes Gen X humor Gen X humor? What influenced your sense of humor growing up? And when I asked people this question, I got almost 1,500 responses, Randall. Can you believe that?
Yeah, I believe. Gen X, we're on the internet, Chris.
We're on the internet. And I'll say this. We all came of age. I mean, I am what's called a cusper. So I was born in December of 1965, which means you could theoretically argue that had I been born earlier that year, I'd be a boomer. And Randall, you were born right in the heart of Gen X, 1975. And there's people who are like born in 85. You guys are cuspers as well. So I want to say something right off the bat. We're going to try to keep this discussion within the technical realm that Randall did beautifully outline, but there's going to be some overlap because comedy is by nature a collaborative medium. So there will be people who cusp from boomers and even maybe people who cusp from millennials, but the dominant sensibility that they're working in is still a Gen X sensibility. So, if you look at those 1970s and the 1980s, I think those were really good decades for comedy, weren't they, Randall? I mean, at this period in history, you've got the rise of comedy clubs, right?
Yeah, the first clubs dedicated to only stand-up comedy were founded. I think the Comedy Store was the first one.
Right. And then New York City, you've got Catch, a rising star. You've got the comic strip. You've got Dangerfield. You have comedy clubs opening all over America at that time. Another thing that you start really seeing a lot of in the 70s is comedy records. I mean, comedy records had been around, but Richard Pryor, I think in 1975, recorded like an hour and a half set at Long Beach Community College. It was just called Richard Pryor Live. And that's when you start getting, it's not like comedy albums that are like, here's funny songs, or here's like, the Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart is probably the first comedy album, but those are in studio. But like just the preponderance of live comedy albums starting in the 70s is pretty big.
Yeah, so a lot of the baby boomers were reaching adulthood and they were going to these comedy clubs and buying these albums that, see, the boomers had grown up watching TV and everything's sanitized on TV. It's network television. And so they go to comedy clubs and they buy these comedy albums and they're not censored anymore, right?
Exactly. Like, look, I actually got to go to a comedy club in 1978, but most of our generation, our introduction to real comedy that they did in the clubs were off of those albums, right? I mean, Robin Williams live, Steve Martin live, all of those people, George Carlin, Pryor, we were way too young, probably because we had lax parents who should have been paying attention, but we got to hear the 21 and over comedy at a very young age because we had access to those albums.
Well, let me say that, yeah, the 70s, that era, like you're talking about how kids had access to everything. I mean, the culture was different then. I mean, this idea of like trying to protect children from adult material, it wasn't as prevalent, I wouldn't say. I mean, it was people were more live and let live. Nudism was like a huge trend. I mean, why not let the kids
right? And but the first time you were
hear everything,
really hearing like cursing, scatology was like this. Now, also around that same time, if you're lucky, and I know this is a class issue, but cable HBO starts in like 1975. I got HBO in 78. When did you guys get HBO?
Me?
Yeah.
Chris, you keep forgetting I grew up poor. I never had HBO as a kid.
All right. So then you didn't. No, that's what I'm saying. No, that's why it might have just been a class issue. But as early as the mid 70s, you could also watch comedy specials on HBO. And those comedy specials are, again, a lot like the comedy albums, but now you got to see visual stuff.
But also, yes, even if you didn't have HBO, VHS rentals started. Like there was a huge thing with VHS rentals. You'd go to this thing called a video rental store, and you'd pick up the VHS tape. And
so
there were a lot of comedy specials that were on VHS, and just like their counterparts on HBO or in the comedy club or on the albums, they weren't censored.
They were definitely, prior to this, the only comedy you would see is on The Tonight Show, which was pretty funny. Don't get me wrong. It's actually quite excellent, but, it was censored, because there's just stuff you could not say. And it had the mystique of the grown-up world. Also around this time, you have Saturday Night Live starting. You have the popularity of improv and sketch groups. You have grown-up cartoons like Doomsbury, satiric magazines like National Lampoon, which is very edgy stuff, or less edgy but easier to have your parents buy you, or like Crazy, Cracked, Mad. So, and then if you had PBS, you got Monty Python, And if you didn't have PBS, you got Benny Hill. So the Brits who were very visual, the Brits who were very silly, the Brits didn't curse as much. But what was like your original take growing up of like the British comedy, like the Monty Python?
Well, like a lot of kids who were growing up in the 70s, 80s, Monty Python was like the thing, man. It was hilarious. Kids loved it. I mean, I remember MTV would even put reruns of Monty Python on late at night. PBS would run some Monty Python. Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I loved it. I mean, it was my first, well, that and Benny Hill. Benny Hill was like my first real taste of sketch comedy. I loved it. Monty Python, I loved it. Yeah, the Brits kind of disown Benny Hill now, just so everyone knows. It's like they think it's like super lowbrow.
But I mean, there was a lot of satire and lampooning. Like Mel Brooks would make movies that made fun of the Western in Blazing Saddles, or he'd make fun of horror movies in Young Frankenstein, or Hitchcock movies in High Anxiety. Woody Allen at the time with Sleeper would make fun of science fiction. National Lampoon would make analysts. There was a lot of comedy about just making fun of things that people used to take very seriously. So at a very early age, definitely in the 70s, and I have to thank really, really maybe the boomers on this one, our parents' generation, there was a lot of irreverency. A lot of the values of the previous generations had been like challenged and attacked.
Well, could I just say something about that? So the boomers, that generation always had a touch of irreverency, especially like when it came to the counterculture, protests of the Vietnam War, the hippies. But there was an era, that baby boom era from the end of World War II till the late 60s, where the media was very tightly controlled. TV was tightly controlled, movies were tightly controlled, and all that started to give way in the late 60s. And with what we were just talking about, the comedy clubs, albums, movie
rating
theaters,
systems.
The movie theaters started having rating systems. They were able to show the more racy European movies, and so it was almost like there was a cultural reaction against all that repression.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. My parents belong to what was called the silent generation, which came just before the boomers, that had they would have the small clubs where they would do their comedy, and then the boomers came, and I would say our parents' generation and the boomers, basically what they did at rock and roll, they also did at comedy, right? Rock and roll came, wiped out jazz, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but it really took over. It became the dominant form of pop music, was rock and roll. And rock and roll in the 70s was everything from, hard rock to country rock to punk. And this is very much where I feel also comedy in America was going in the 70s and early 80s. And then you get to the 80s and you get finally what I would argue is a shift, because America is becoming more conservative, but the comedy is becoming even more like far out. And you get to, I think, when you're a little kid, Robin Williams, you were a big Robin Williams fan, I'm sure.
Sure, of course, Mork and Mindy.
Right, Mork and Mindy. We knew Robin Williams really through, we knew him through a kids' TV show. We knew Richard Pryor through kids' movies. We knew Bill Cosby. I got to bring him up, man, through, Fat Albert. We knew Steve Martin as Steve Martin, but Steve Martin's stuff like King Tut and The Jerk was just perfect for children. So much of these very cutting edge comics were very good with kids. And then really, I would argue the very first cusper to really hit the scene, which means he's still a little older than us, but he's not a boomer in the way that we see boomers, is Eddie Murphy. Right? Eddie Murphy was like he was to us what maybe like Elvis Presley was to my mom's generation, right? He was 18 years old when he started on SNL in 1981, and every sketch he did, like the next day, me and my friends in high school would just quote verbatim. How about you? You guys, even, I know you're.
Yeah, when I was a kid, Eddie Murphy Raw, his comedy albums, very popular. Eddie Murphy was very dirty on these albums, and all the little kids in junior high school loved it.
Right. But even if you, but like, I'm not even talking about like Delirious or that, but even the stuff he just did, on Saturday Night Live with Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, or I'm Gumby, God damn it.
You know,
That was,
yeah, that stuff was great, but I'll just say that for a little kid, like junior high level, maybe even high school, is like Saturday Night Live was a late time show. It was like 11:30 Saturday night. I mean, most of us kids weren't even up, so a lot of us kids
I'm 10
wouldn't have
years
seen
older than you. So obviously I'm giving everyone the older part of the Gen X story.
But I'm just saying, like my experience with Eddie Murphy is like his comedy albums.
Right.
They were real popular with us.
And don't forget the movies, right? Coming to America, Trading Places, 48 Hours. He also was the first young movie star in comedy. I mean, he was, I asked a lot of people to name stuff they liked, and we'll get to that in a bit. But Eddie Murphy was really, in our experience, the first young person, even if he was a little older than us, to just come in with a new sensibility, a new attitude. Also, let's look at what are the historical and social conditions that also shaped being a Gen Xer. You talked a little bit about the fact that the boomers were a larger group than we were, right? They dominated everything. Their tastes dominated everything.
They still do, Chris.
Their social issues dominated everything, but we were under their boot, right?
Still are.
We were under their boot. So beyond that, some other things that I really feel shaped us, specifically made us different from our parents' generation and made us different from the boomers. And in some ways, folks, make us different than the younger generations too, who came after us. I wrote down 9 things, and please add whatever. First off, we're the first generation that really experienced massive divorce rates.
Right. That's because the divorce laws changed. They made it much easier to get a divorce, and so you had lots of divorce.
And you're a child of divorce, right?
In a sense, my parents never really got married, so.
Oh, okay. Well, your parents are separated.
Yes.
That's my point. My point is that you didn't grow. My dad died when I was 2.5, so I've yet to meet a lot of people who lost their dads. But I've always known a lot of people whose parents did not cohabitate under one roof, and that always seemed pretty normal to me. Would you say, what percentage of the people you know?
Yeah, growing up, almost everybody I knew, their parents were divorced. They had a step parent. Almost everybody. Like,
yeah, you had parents who dated.
Yeah, if I knew somebody whose parents were still together, like from birth, it was like weird.
Right, which is a massive contradiction from the boomers who really loved aping the whole thing. Same with the concept of the American dream, that the boomers were like, hey man, I don't want to sell out. I'm going to be living on a farm in Vermont. Oh, wait a second. I like making a lot of money. I'm going to move to the city and be rich. And that's a lot of their comedy. But during our time, the American dream just destroyed. Labor unions in the 70s and 80s lost their status. By the end of the 80s, even a college degree was just no guarantee of entrance into the American middle class.
Yeah, the unions were destroyed in the 70s. They started dying, and Reagan really finished them off with
home ownership, 30-year job security. That all died while we were growing up. Our parents could count on an employer for 30 years. We knew that was not going to be us. Increasing political corruption. I mean, when I was 7 years old, the president of the United States had to leave for being a crook. and it never got any better after Nixon, did it? I mean,
yeah, Nixon really set the tone for just about every politician after him. I mean, after Nixon, nobody trusts politicians anymore. Everyone's really cynical about politics. I mean, Donald Trump campaigns by saying all sorts of cynical things. I mean, that would have never happened without...
Authority figures just didn't matter. Religious leaders got caught lying. Famous, I think not just Nixon, but I think of the televangelists. I think about local politicians. All of a sudden, once the news no longer protected famous people and started going after them, and we started learning about how Elvis Presley really died, public figures just all got taken down a notch to the point where I think that's where we got our trademark, suspect everybody, right? And then also, as I said earlier, the hypocrisy of the hippies. As small children, the boomer generation was like, hey, peace, love, meaning. And then all of a sudden around the 80s, it's like, No, I'm going to make money. I'm going to live away from those people. I'm going to sell out my principles because you know what? I like the comfortable life.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, this is another show, but yeah, the hippies, they seem to be idealists and try to be utopian in certain ways. I think the hippie movement had a lot of positive effects on our culture, but we'll have to talk about another thing. But yeah,
yeah,
the general consensus in our culture is that the hippies were hypocrites, like you said.
yeah. And by the way, those of who stayed pure hippies, we still rejected them because we knew that they were unrealistic. So a lot of people in our generation, I'm my particular age cohort, we were the largest group to support Ronald Reagan. And now I'm not going to be political this time out. I'm going to just acknowledge and appreciate that there's a lot of people in our generation who are Republicans and who are conservatives.
Well,
And
when I was growing up, there was a renewed conservative movement, the Young
but
Republicans,
part of
Rush
that,
Limbaugh, sure.
no, I'm not even saying that. Just in general. So yeah, people in the '80s who were actually critical of the '70s were very funny. But we had AIDS, and AIDS really kind of killed any humor about the sexual revolution because whereas comics before were all talking about how great sex was, for us, sex could kill you. Same with drug humor, which had so fueled previous generations like Cheech and Chong and all that. You know, we grew up with crack, angel dust, PCP, all sorts of drug fatalities. So I don't really think drug humor is ever as resonant with our generation. Um, on the positive side, we did, you know, deal with the rise of personal computers and social media. We outlived the threat of Soviet annihilation, but we also, the very last thing that really defined us is the beginning of terrorism. So, you know, from like, I guess, 1992 to 2001, there was a beautiful part of the 90s where we didn't really worry about much. And the other thing that I really think, and the last thing I'll bring up, is increasing social awareness. You know, in our time, coming of age and continuing to come of age, different groups of people became recognized. Different values became. We've become over time a more inclusive society, a more socially aware society. So one of the key things that shaped our sense of humor was knowing what's funny and what's just fucking offensive. Although we love offensive humor. So Randall, when does Gen X make its debut on the comedy scene? So for me, I'd say uh, Gen X humor, you know, the first time you really see Gen X isn't really where Gen X is writing their comedy, or it's one with actors, right? I would argue really it's like Gary Coleman in Different Strokes. It's the girls on Facts of Life. It's people like John Cusack, who did all of those movies in the '80s, or Molly Ringwald and all those other John Hughes movies, right? They're the first Gen Xers to be funny. They're not writing their own material, but they're
Well, yeah,
carrying.
the John Hughes movies are extremely popular with Gen X. All everybody knew growing up, watched these movies. John Hughes, he was born in 1950, solidly a baby boomer, but he is trying to write for the new generation.
But do you feel that the sensibility of, say, a Nancy McKeon or a Lisa Whelchel or any of those girls on that show, or Gary Coleman, or you know, let's bring it up a bit, Molly Ringwald. I mean, John Hughes. Like, I do think this is a tricky thing. Does an actor have a sensibility that grounds their generation? I would say yes. So I think on some level, the beginning of Gen X comedy is even when you have Gen X actors interpreting boomer dialogue, right? I mean, on some level, it's filtered through a Gen X sensibility.
You know, you're right though that the it is interesting to think about these people in that were big with our generation. I mean, it's like a motley crew, isn't it? I mean, Gary Coleman. I mean, if you had to point to one person who was the biggest star of our childhoods, it might be Gary Coleman.
Yeah, I mean, when I was
And you know, when Gary
yeah,
Coleman became an adult, he became completely forgotten,
right.
and he even had to work as a security guard for a while.
But Gary Coleman, and if you really want to go all the way back to the Partridge Family to Danny Bonaduce, was this thing that our generation had, which was called the young kid who talks like a middle-aged man. It started out with Danny in the Partridge Family. You saw it with Arnold Drummer in Different Strokes. You saw it with all the girls in Facts of Life. This trope, and it was fun to see. You even saw it in Family Ties. with Michael J. Fox, who is clearly a boomer. But it's still that idea that our generation wasn't going to be children. Our generation was going to grow up fast. And then you do have those John Hughes style movies in the mid to late 80s with people like Matthew Broderick, also technically a boomer, who are showing kind of a different face of youth, one that's a little more disaffected, a little bit more removed.
It's very interesting you should say this because I think you're nailing something here. I mean, it's like I think this is how a lot of the baby boomers saw themselves as kids. A lot of the baby boomers had this attitude growing up, and through their youth that they were smarter than their parents, more sophisticated than their parents, and it may have been true in that era. And when they started making movies and TV, it's exactly what you're saying. You see that in depictions of children.
Yeah, but it was
we grew up with that kind of like idea that it's possible.
We grew up with that idea that that's what a child is. A child is just a middle-aged person trapped in the body of a child. We never had childhood as something like our kids were always portrayed on TV as the smartest person in the room. So immediately being a smart ass was just kind of like our marching orders. And it's weird too, because if you do watch like the late 80s, early 90s Saturday Night Live, which does feel a lot of people who will go on to be very big, and we'll mention them as Gen X comics, they're not really that great at the beginning because they're being outsized by the Dana Carveys and the John Lovitzes. But I honestly think the moment it really broke for me was in I want to say 1992. I'd have to look it up. It could have been 1990. Yeah, I think it's 92. It was the summer of 1992. Do you remember when Dennis Miller had the Dennis Miller Show?
Okay, yeah, his talk show?
Yeah, his talk show. So Dennis Miller, clearly a boomer, but very funny and very popular with our generation because in many ways he was so dark, so cynical. He really, and we haven't even talked about what is the adjective. So let's take a moment to say, I asked people and I got a lot of like, Gen X humor is dark. Gen X humor is cynical. Gen X humor is ironic, but in a sarcastic way. And I got variations of this. It's irreverent, it's perverse. But the best description I honestly thought someone wrote was Gen X humor is dark, but it's always true. It's always dark to the point of truth, right? I mean, say what you want to say about how cynical we are. Say what you want to say about how ironic or sarcastic. And remember, sarcasm belies a deeper truth, right? When we're saying the opposite of what we mean, in order for sarcasm to work, we have to mean what we really say, right? It's a paradox.
Yeah. I think a lot of Gen X humor is you just say the truth, and you're supposed to laugh because the truth is ridiculous.
Right, but it's not observational. Now, I do think, before I get into that, people like Dennis Miller, I do think that we have to separate the 70s comics from the 80s comics because the Dennis Millers were awesome. One of the things I loved about Dennis Leary, Mitch Heidelberg, even Dice Clay is and Kinnison is that they were just so dark and they were so willing to just go to these very honest places. Even Howard Stern, even Joan Rivers, like these people were willing to get out there and say what is true. And as long as it was true, it justified what they were saying.
Right. That's a great list. Those are all baby boomers, but you're saying that those are the people Gen X thought were funny, right?
Right. And those were like, even Jay Leno in the 80s was that guy. You wouldn't know it today, but the difference between 70s observational, let it all hang out drug shit and like 80s humor was very pointed. The movies were pointed. Everywhere you look, the good stuff really had something to say.
Yeah, it's funny, like somebody like a Howard Stern, or even Eddie Murphy, it's like, so the Gen X grew up listening to ribald humor, dirty humor, true humor, and true entertainment, and so the kids today, it seems like they get offended, or they're a little bit. It's like they have a different perception of like what comedy should be like.
It was the last era that you could, for better or for worse, it was the last era where you could say whatever you damn well pleased. Well, that may not be a good thing, but I wanted to say that because in 1992, I'm watching the Dennis Miller Show, and I see you truly the very first Gen X comic I've ever seen in my life. How do I know this? Because she says she's Gen X. And that was Janeane Garofalo, who did her 5-minute set introducing herself as Gen X. We're the people waiting between jobs on unemployment. She was dark. She was cynical. She was painfully honest. She did not make jokes about dieting like a lot of female comics do, or dating like a lot of female comics do. She had dark hair. She had a very counterculture, new wave-ish look about her. She was really just pretty much to the point. I don't know. Did you ever see her early '90s stuff?
Yeah. So when she hit the comedy scene and she started getting on TV, I mean, I'm sure everybody loved her in my generation. I mean, yeah, she was the ultimate Gen X stand-up. And could I just say something, a little tidbit about her? I think I saw an HBO special she did, and she brought a notepad up so she could read her jokes off the notepad in the HBO special. And that's like, I don't think any comic's ever done that ever besides her that one time. And that's like the ultimate Gen X move. Okay.
It was.
It's like, it's so cynical. It's so detached. It's so, I don't care.
And we'll get back to Janeane Garofalo a little later because I ended up seeing her only last year, and I'll talk about that. But the key was she broke big, and she was talking about things that I could relate to, and she was talking about things I could relate to from my own lived experience, and that was very liberating. When someone starts, when you get, it's kind of like with rock and roll, like when you get that rock star who like, hey, they're talking about what it's like. I mean, they get me. You feel seen, and you relate. And I became a big fan, and that was around the time that she started doing a lot of comedy. Also, around this time, she does a TV show, which I honestly think of as the very first Gen X TV show, which is the Ben Stiller Show. Did you ever watch that?
Yeah, Ben Stiller Show was a one-camera sketch comedy show. When I was taking improv classes like about 10 years ago, that was everybody's favorite show.
Yeah, and the Ben Stiller Show was really the first TV show that not only featured Gen X people, but was written by Gen X people. It gave us a sense of what do Gen X people find funny. It didn't last very long, like anything that is ahead of its time.
It's a great Gen X story. Okay, so it's one of the greatest sketch comedy shows of all time. It runs for 2 seasons. It gets canceled because of low ratings, and then it won an Emmy.
Yeah, well, it could not be more Gen X, right? Like it does everything you're supposed to do.
And I remember
well.
I remember Ben Stiller when he accepted the Emmy. It was like, I don't know. You should probably find his speech on YouTube. It's super ironic in Gen X.
It could not be a more.
Yeah, thanks, but my show's canceled.
Right. It could, and that kind of is like so. Like instead of getting angry, like the Smother Brothers get canceled for being too anti-Vietnam, Gen X goes, yeah, like because we're so used to disappointment that it's like we almost celebrate disappointment. There's a very key element of Gen X humor. Whereas on the converse, the year that a show like that got canceled in 1994, guess what show starts on the air that is considered a remarkably Gen X show, Randall?
What?
Friends.
Oh, Friends.
Friends, the first show to feature an all Gen X cast about Gen X life. What's today's 20-something like? Starring fresh-faced 20-somethings in New York doing 20-something things. Written by Boomers. And
well, did you watch
that show? That now I was like, go for it. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask you if you watched it because I didn't really watch it.
Oh, I watched it, and that was around the time I was trying to be a TV writer. And let me tell you, that was the most boomer take. You know, like if you want to see 40-year-olds and late 30-year-olds and middle-aged people trying to remember what it was like to be a single person in the 1970s and 80s through a 1994 filter, go watch early seasons of Friends. It does eventually get a writing staff that is more Gen X, but when it first started out, I mean, it has that very like sex comedy farce thing, you know, and you can tell like it's so. But that's another thing that I really want to talk about, which is once our generation breaks, there's a war kind of going on between people writing for Gen X and people who are Gen X. And I want to look at two different films.
Well, before we get into that, could I just mention my favorite Gen X show? It's an MTV show called Daria. It was an animated show, and I think this is the ultimate Gen X TV show of all time. So Daria stars like a Janeane Garofalo type. I'm sure they copied her from Janeane Garofalo.
Oh, yeah.
Janeane Garofalo type kid in high school, a young lady, and she is just critical and cynical about everything around her. And the show is so weird because it's like all these things are happening around Daria, and she's just criticizing everything for being so ridiculous and empty, and she's super cynical, and she doesn't really participate in life very much. And that's the show.
I just saw someone pointed out that Daria and all of her friends now would be in their 40s. And I really would love to watch that 40-something. And I also say this, I think the first Gen X TV show that was mainstream popular is Gilmore Girls, which is written by Dan and Amy Sherman Palladino, who are both Gen Xers, starring Lauren Graham, who's a Gen Xer. Alexis Bledel, Rory, would have been born actually in 1984. So her character is a Gen Xer, and the actress playing her, who was born in 1983, is a Gen Xer. So it's a very strange show because it's about a Gen X mom having a Gen X daughter, being Gen Xers at the two polarities of Gen X, written by a Gen Xer. And it has a remarkable Gen X sensibility while being what I would still say is a very traditional TV show.
Yeah, there's a lot of the Gen X criticism and cynicism of everything going on around them. I mean, it's kind of like Daria Light.
Right, but you get literally the entire, if you look at it from just that graph you gave before, you get the entire continuum of early Gen X to late Gen X when watching the Gilmore Girls, because, Rory and
Lorelai.
Lorelai is my age. She's the first Gen Xer, and Rory is the last Gen Xer. Because remember, they're only 50. I think they're only 16 years apart in age. So, that made that show fascinating because it was the only show where you really had the entire Gen X conversation going on, and it was a very tight show that lasted many years, and is more mainstream. So that's why I wanted to pick on that. But then, I want to take two different things. First, I want to look at Wayne's World. Wayne's World, very big comedy. You guys love that movie. I could have just as easily said Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right? Very funny, right? It's about two dudes who would be two suburban dudes around our age, right? They're always these guys in their late teens who just kind of get into stuff. And they're, they have low ambitions. They're kind of stoners. They're just kind of walking through life. They're the slacker, right? Our generation is so defined by that term, even though the movie was done by a boomer, right? The word slacker defined early Gen X because unlike the boomers, we weren't going to be yuppies, nor were we going to be hippies. So slacker is lacks the ambition of a yuppie and lacks the spirituality of a hippie.
Well, we couldn't get jobs. We couldn't afford houses. We couldn't get a career. And so we lived in our mom's basement, and we're on cable access and learned to play an instrument. That's right. That's what that's about.
And if you look at the way the boomers characterize us, the slacker really just lacks ambition. The slacker's just too busy. In both Bill and Ted and Wayne's World, you never actually see them get stoned. It's implied that they're so busy just being man-child that they don't have time to, they should just grow up and get it all.
Yeah, that's an interesting interpretation of that, because I definitely think that when the slacker stereotype started appearing, I mean, people in my generation, our generation, Chris, they understood it right away. It's because you've kind of accepted that you'll never get anywhere in life. Okay,
but I don't really think we ever embraced it. I don't think that's a fair. I don't like when people call our generation slacker.
Okay, but well, let me finish. But it was other generations that looked at the slacker stereotype and saw it in a different way. saw it in a way that these people are lazy, they're not ambitious and all that. But I think, I mean, personally, when I was young, I totally clued into the idea that you're a slacker because the doors are closed to you, correct?
Well, I think you're going to like what I'm going to say, which is that whereas Wayne's World was a caricature of what it was like to be a Gen Xer, and Wayne's World comes out in 92, based on sketches written by Dana Carvey and Mike Myers in the late 80s to early 90s, based on growing up when they were teenagers in the late 70s. Kevin Smith in 1994 puts out Clerks. And Clerks is, in my opinion, the truth that belies Wayne's World, right? Those dudes are dudes. They absolutely get high. They absolutely get drunk. They absolutely are, hey man. But those dudes are also working their butts off, right? They got bills to pay.
Well, yes. So Clerks is completely grounded in reality. If you haven't seen Clerks, it's one of the great all-time classic movies. If you're interested in like Gen X culture, watch Clerks and Daria for sure.
Right, but Clerks really took the dude concept, right? Eliminated the idea of being a slacker, even though technically his buddy,
Randall.
Sorry, man.
He's got my name. What?
He is a slacker, as is Silent Bob, but there's a contrast at least. While they're being dudes, Dante has to go to work. It's not even his day. He's not even supposed to be there, right? He has to fill in, right? And it really shows you that if we were going to really deal with the dudes, today's Gen Xers, it's not that, as you just said earlier, it's not that they lack ambition. It's that life's expensive and they're poor.
Yeah, and Clerks really depicts like the workaday life of wage labor, where somebody's got to be at the store and the manager has to go in because nobody's coming in, and it's like he doesn't want to be in. It's his day off. He's working on his day off. I mean, this is life, okay? Yeah. I mean, the boomers and cushy unions would never understand this, okay?
There's a lot going on in Clerks, but none of it is wacky. None of it is wacky. Because, I mean, later on, Kevin Smith would get wacky. But right in that movie, it's what someone just said before. It's dark, but it's painfully honest. Another comparison, and it's a good movie. I'm not putting it down. And it's a very much a Gen X film. It's like the American Graffiti of Gen X.
Remember how we were talking about permissiveness in the culture, language, ribald humor. I mean, Clerks is a perfect epitome of that because, Kevin Smith makes this movie Clerks, and it's going to get an X rating for language alone, which would never happen before in the history of the world. And, they had to fight, the studio had to fight to bring it down. But you can see the Kevin Smith sensibility. It's very Gen X. It's very, we can use dirty words. There's nothing wrong with dirty words and ribald humor.
Absolutely. And I was going to announce something else. Before I get into the next one, I want to point out also, Clerks, our generation, one thing that's very key about Gen X, and you see it more in the Ben Stiller show, but we take pop culture seriously, very seriously, much more seriously than any other generation, which normally thought it was silly and would just use it for cheap jokes. But in Clerks, there is an amazing monologue about the guys who were working the Death Star. Remember that monologue?
Yes, of course.
And it's a great one about like, well, those guys are just contractors. Like, what did they do? What did they do to deserve to get killed, right? What did they do? They did nothing. So I love it's the first. Our generation is clearly obsessed with Star Wars, and even though Star Wars monologue.
Yeah, well, even though Star Wars is like definitely a product of the boomers, it's the later generations that loved it, and it's because, like you're saying, taking pop culture seriously. Before Star Wars, nobody in the entertainment industry really took themselves seriously. They would make these science fiction movies, and they'd be almost like a joke, and then George Lucas comes along, and he makes Star Wars, and he's very serious about the whole thing. It's got to look very convincing. No one ever thought about doing it like that before.
Yeah, and that's what you see also, like Reality Bites, directed by Ben Stiller, written by Alice Childress, a Gen X screenwriter. This is one of the early romantic comedies. There's a beautiful monologue delivered by Janeane Garofalo about dying and how she sees her own funeral like an episode of Melrose Place and it's so very specific to how Melrose Place would do it, but at the same time she's also really talking about how she's afraid of dying and no one caring. And the ability to incorporate pop culture, not just for ironic points, but to show just how because we grew up watching more TV than anyone else, how much it really also there's almost a pathos to it. So what I was also going to just say very quickly is that Clueless is a really beautiful movie made by a boomer featuring a lot of Gen X kids, but it's still Amy Heckerling who really got kids in a great way. Still, if you compare that to Rushmore, which is written by Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson, who are technically writing about almost millennials or the very youngest of the Gen Xers, you can really see such a difference because there's a certain kind of happiness that runs throughout Clueless, and there's a certain kind of sadness that runs throughout Rushmore, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, they both have yeah, yes, Chris.
High school life is so much nicer in Clueless than it is in Rushmore.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that's like two sides of the same coin?
Well, you'd start seeing it in Freaks and Geeks that, we stopped making high school. Once we started doing our own stuff, we stopped making high school a happy place. And we started making high school a much our view of teenage life is not the boomers' view of teenage life. It's a much darker, harder, cynical view. And also it becomes the introduction of directors who really do speak to our generation, like Wes Anderson, Noah Baumbach, Spike Jonze.
So Clueless is the last of the old way of depicting
and
high
then once
school.
you get people like Wes Anderson, or like you look at like Noah Baumbach's The Squid and the Whale and his takedown on the parents of our generation, or any of I'll get to Noah Baumbach a little later, but or The Royal Tenenbaums, or Being John Malkovich, and you look at John, you look at even though it's really about John Cusack. Look at John Cusack's performance in that. We have just a much darker sensibility as filmmakers, and I like it, but it's very much not about that. Like even the way we handle man-child, right? Like for the early '90s, the most common man-child was like the Adam Sandler movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he's Billy Madison, he's Happy Gilmore, and it's pretty like kick-ass low humor. And then when you get to like the 2000s, it's the same thing even with romantic comedies with women. You start off with like the most baby boomer Gen X loved romantic comedy, Pretty Woman, and then you get to Bridesmaids, right? You get to Bridesmaids, you get to School of Rock, you get to The Hangover, you get to Trainwreck, right? Like you start looking at the journey when you finally get people like a Judd Apatow, Paul Feig. I wish I could name some women. This is on me. I should have done better research. I'm not loving how...
You're talking about man-child?
But man-child and woman-child, right?
Well,
like,
Amy Schumer is like, she's done a number of woman-child movies.
Right, but I'm just saying, if you look at Kristen Wiig and Amy Schumer at the end of that journey versus, say, Jennifer Aniston and Julia Roberts at the beginning of that journey, or the difference between Adam Sandler at the beginning of that journey versus, say, someone like Jack Black. Like like in that period of time between the more carefree 90s and the early 2000s, you do start to see that as we mature, our own sensibility is really starting to come into play, right? The stories that we tell about ourselves are less about, it's more about how we deal with responsibility, right? Like School of Rock in many ways is about how you deal with responsibility. Trainwreck is how do you deal with a responsible relationship. Bridesmaids is how do you become a good bridesmaid. And it's interesting because I would argue more than any other generation beforehand, we're almost very morally conservative in our comedies, like we're really talking about on all those films about even The Hangover, how to be a good friend. We really are talking in many ways about how to be your best self, right? We're not talking like the previous generations, like The Graduate, or Animal House is much more about being free of responsibility, right? That both the boomers and our parents' generation love to tell comedies about breaking social norms. And if you start looking at things that we make, it's much more about embracing social norms but reinterpreting them with our own values.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think the countercultural attitudes of the '60s and '70s they pretty much died out, especially for Gen X.
Right. We don't
Gen X
because
is irreverent. Gen X is questioning.
we saw what happens when you walk away from responsibility. You have a lot of kids without parents. You have a lot of drugs that'll fuck you up. You have like diseases that some sex will kill you. We saw the downside of letting go. And then it informs, I think, the other thing I really want to get into, which is alt comedy, right? Every generation had its alt comedy. I've already talked about Janeane Garofalo, but then there's people like Patton Oswalt, Dave Cross, Sarah Silverman, Zach Galifianakis, Margaret Cho. What do you think is so defining about Gen X's alt comedy?
Uh, what is so defining about our alternate comedy?
Besides the fact that, for example, I would argue this generation has more alt comics than traditional comics. For whatever reason, maybe it's because middle age. I think possibly.
Well, why would you consider that?
Boomers dominate the comedy clubs.
Why would you consider them alt comics?
Okay, here's why. Boomers dominate the comedy clubs, and they really did back in the 80s and 90s, making it very hard for our generation to really break through in the comedy scene. We'll get to Chris Rock in 1 second, I promise, and Dave Chappelle in 1 second, I promise. But for the most part, Gen X, and I remember it's trying to break in '91 myself. And in '91, it was really the Dennis Learys, the Dice Clays. Like, you really had to just be, hard, and very tough. And if you wanted to really talk about bright and analytical and abstract things, the traditional comedy clubs just weren't having it. So people were opening up clubs in like coffee shops. I went to on Ludlow Street, Marc Maron back in the mid 90s had an alternative comedy venue I would go to, and I'd catch him and Sarah Silverman and Jeff Ross. And then here in the late 90s, there was also an alternative comedy club hosted by Beth Lapidus, where I would see people like Margaret Cho and actually a lot of the other people I just mentioned earlier, but I'd see them on the West Coast. And in those alternative clubs, people were drinking alcohol, but for the most part, we were drinking coffee, and it was much more about, it wasn't so much set up punchline. It wasn't even so much about the act out. It was more about like, hey, here's what's going on in my life right now. And isn't that like, and what's your attitude about it? Like, is what's going on in your life right now happy, sad, or good? I saw Colin Quinn, who I know is a boomer, but even Colin Quinn, like in a coffee shop, talking about growing up in the 70s and how his sister was into drugs. Like, I think I definitely remember when I saw Maron said, you're not here to watch punchline and setup, you're just here to see people just share their truth. And just the concept of sharing your truth with an irreverent perspective seemed more genuine and sincere.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. So, in the '80s, there was this thing called the comedy boom, where like comedy went mainstream, and there are all these comedy clubs, and a lot of traveling comics were making a lot of money, and most of these comics had to deliver, because people were paying a lot of money. So they would, they would have a very standard set up punchline, make people laugh, 10 minutes, very simple jokes. But yeah, the alt comedy scene kind of grew up at some point where maybe it was free because you just wanted to try out new material, you wanted to experiment. So yeah, so you'd get more long-winded stuff. You'd get comics that would go up and not even tell jokes. I think
long-winded is a pejorative, and I wouldn't say that. I'd just say that you have less formulistic joke telling. You're not all about the act out. You're not all about the punchline. You're really about, finding a way of saying something in an honest way. That because you are by nature a humorous person, will just come out in a humorous way.
Yeah, and you had some of that at the beginning of stand-up comedy in the 70s, and then stand-up comedy in a sort of sense kind of went corporate, and then
yeah.
And then the alternative comedy scene, it was like a counterculture. It was like a what is it? Is an alternative to that? There you go. It's
Right.
like
Also, the comedy clubs weren't at that time, and I'm speaking from experience, they weren't tremendously Gen X friendly.
well,
The kind
you
of
think
people
that's
would
true?
normally, yeah, I know. In New York, they weren't. I don't know about where you grew up, but in New York City, they really weren't Gen X friendly. They really were normally people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who had some money, who wanted to get drunk, who had their girlfriend or their wife, who wanted to hear about, hey, I want to hear about how stupid the young people are, or I want to talk about, I want to hear some, I thought they were jerky, crass, horny fucks who are embittered by life, who want to hear other people say, you know what's hard about being an old man? Let me tell you about my spleen. Oh, my boy. Ugh. And today's kids, they're all gay. I don't like, it's like guys like, it was horrible. There was a lot of misogyny, racism, and sexism going on in the clubs because
Yeah,
that was what sold.
yeah.
So if you wanted to escape the toxicity of the club scene or the dominance of comic people who ran clubs who would only book the kind of remember, the people who control the clubs and the bookers were not Gen X people. So they didn't even get Gen X comedy. You know,
Yeah,
Mitzi
true.
Shore did not get Gen X comedy. If you look at all the great people who came out of her clubs, they were not Gen X comics.
I've been to the Comedy Store recently. Well, recently, so to speak, before COVID. But I think the Comedy Store, the comics there, they've
Yeah.
become more like alternative comics. And a lot of the alternative comics I used to see,
Yeah.
like at like unpaid free venues, doing a show in a tiny theater or something. A lot of them have moved over and to the big clubs like the Comedy Store now.
So let me explain Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle because it's a beautiful story. Chris Rock was discovered by Eddie Murphy. We've talked about him before. His company, his representatives, his management took on Chris Rock, and they got him to a lot of places. And then Chris Rock discovered Dave Chappelle, and he brought the same management team that handled Eddie Murphy, and Chris Rock took over Dave Chappelle. So in a weird way, we really got to thank Eddie Murphy for both opening doors in very mainstream venues for Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. And Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, and I met Dave Chappelle when he was 19. I've never met Chris Rock, but I will say that they were traditionalists. They were students of traditional stand-up comedy. They understood joke structure. And I think what they did was they found a way of being more like Carlin. I would argue that Carlin and Pryor really both inform, and Eddie Murphy informed Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. They're philosophers, they're social critics. They really wanted to talk about their own experiences in a very honest way, but they also found a way of splitting that difference so that people who were more mainstream could get them. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think though that these three comics you're talking about, they worked at it. I mean, they put a lot of hours into doing stand up. I mean, you're talking about three.
All of these people I did. I'm just saying, but they found a way of making a place in the clubs, making a place on the Tonight Show, making a place on HBO specials. They found a way of crossing over, whereas a lot of the old comics did it. And it's not because the old comics didn't put the time in. It's just because these guys figured out a way of splitting the difference. Maybe because by just being African Americans, they already were outside.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, you might be right about that. I mean, I'm not sure, Chris. I'll have to think about it.
I mean, it's a topic almost for another show, but my bigger point is that Chris Rock, and I'm going to not include Dave Chappelle because I'm kind of annoyed with him right now. But if you want to include Dave Chappelle, be my guest. And by the way, people like Neil Brennan and Louis C.K. do owe their careers to Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, as do a number of other writers who we probably won't get to. But my point is, I think that the best Gen X comic, recognized by other people who are in our generation and the boomers as well, and even the young ones, I just think that Chris Rock is the best representative of our generation as a stand-up. I think that all of the great qualities of honesty, cynicism, truth, absurdity, all can be seen in his comedy.
Okay, he was born the same year you were.
65.
Yeah, I mean, I would say though that Chris Rock is probably the greatest stand-up of all time. so so I don't know.
Okay,
Is he
well,
good? Is he a good representative of Gen X humor? Sure, but
I think so
I
because
think he's a good representative of all stand up.
I would never confuse him with Jerry Seinfeld, and I'd never confuse him with John Mulaney, and I wouldn't even confuse him with the alt comics. In fact, I remember there was an interview about how alt comics all loved Albert Brooks, and that how Albert Brooks's dry sensibility influenced them. So they asked Albert Brooks who his favorite comic was of the new generation. And he said, "Oh yeah, Chris Rock," which because Chris Rock really gets it. So let's talk about today. So I wanted to talk about social media, uh, and let's go over. We're just going to cover 14 memes in social media for Gen X because I want to talk now less about individual people, and I want to really look at our generation's sense of humor. There's no better way than to look at us because we grew up on the internet. We were the first generation to make jokes on the internet. We didn't grow up on the internet, but we were the first ones to graffiti all over it. So let's go with the first one, please. All right, so you can learn a lot about our generation through our memes. First off, we love Ferris Bueller,
Yeah, this is a shot, a still from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
where he's just given himself a mohawk. It's actually the beginning, and it really speaks to the fact that we were a latchkey generation left without much parental supervision and none of the great toys of the younger generation. So we just entertain ourselves. Next. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go back because there are people listening. So if you're just listening, I'm going to read what it says. It's Ferris Bueller. He's given himself a mohawk in the shower, and it says, "I'm Gen X, so perfectly capable of entertaining myself," which is a slight dig, I think, on the other generations that need constant entertainment. Go on. Next one, Ferris Bueller says, "If there's," and it's a quote, which is weird. "If there's one thing Gen X love, it's being told who they are and what they should do." And this is a great example of what we'd call sarcasm, right, Randall?
Yeah, it's you're not supposed to take it seriously or literally.
And even the face that Matthew Broderick making is that smart ass face that is so very Gen X, even though he is a boomer. But it also speaks to the anger of our generation. Next, please. So we were probably like the last generation to really hear music before there was videos, and the first generation to embrace music videos. So here is an old man teaching a class, and it says, "So the legend says that the M from MTV originally stood for music because it was such a part of our youth. It was so distinguishing MTV for us, and now it's gone. And it's sad because our connection to music is also very defining, as were the videos. In fact, when you think of your favorite songs of your youth, don't you see the videos in your head?
Sure. And people won't believe it, but yeah, MTV used to be just wall to wall music videos. Now everybody watches them on YouTube. Now MTV is like actual programming.
Yeah. All right, next. I love this one. I think it's from Twin Peaks. It's a girl on the phone. I can't remember what the character was. And it's actually a Twitter one. It says, "Kurt warned us and we took heed. Hashtag Gen X." And it reads, "It's Kurt Cobain from 1991. He says we're stupid and contagious." Which again, it's the line from Smells Like Teen Spirit. And this one came out, by the way, during the COVID. So I think it's really about how stupid we are about not masking. But it works on so many levels because it's also about how, unlike, say, another generation that gets its quotes from poetry, we're still a generation that is more than happy to quote pop culture songs. What do you think of this one, Randall?
Yeah, you're right. It's
All right,
got
one
all the
more,
Gen X things. Twin Peaks was huge.
One more from the COVID era. This shows, well, I'll show it. It says, "There's the cure." The photo of the cure from the 80s, and it says, "I'm no expert on COVID-19, but this is the cure."
It's a little pun because it's a picture of the band
Right.
The Cure.
Someone has pointed out that dad jokes is very much a Gen X thing. And unlike the last one, which was at least a social comment, I guess this could be seen as a dad joke, isn't it? I mean, it's just a pun.
I remember growing up. I mean, there was like kind of like a type of comedy called bad jokes. I mean, now they
Yeah,
call them dad jokes. But do you remember this,
yeah,
Chris? So for a long
yeah,
time, many years, people would. There even used to be like bad joke stand-up shows sometimes, and people
yeah.
would just get up and try to do like really bad jokes, puns. I mean, and the humor. I mean, it's a very Gen X kind of thing, because the humor is from laughing at how bad it is.
Right. And it's in poor taste because, COVID is killing people. And here's someone who's making a joke about the cure. But it's funny because I miss the cure. Next. This one is a scene from Back to the Future around the very end when Doc Brown is confronting Marty after we'll get back in the time machine. And it says, I've seen the future, Marty. 30 years from now, all of the people who lived through this great 80s decade will wish they could travel back in time and live through it all again. And I would definitely say, like the boomers who missed the 60s or the 70s, it's fair to say our generation very much is nostalgic for its youth. Does this one work with you, man?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, this one isn't even funny as much as it's just poignant. All right,
Well,
next.
it's funny because when you're growing up in the '80s, I mean, you didn't think it. I mean, kids today think of it as like a lot of people think of it as like this idyllic time now. I
Yeah.
mean, it's funny because I don't know, it didn't seem like that back then.
Also, we looked to the future because we wanted to escape what we thought was a bad era. No one loved the 80s in the 80s. None of us did. We were all like, man, I can't wait for the future to come. And now, of course, disappointment is a great theme of 80s, of Gen X humor. So, what would be more disappointing than knowing that the future you're going to be inheriting is even worse than the future you're trying to get out of? All right, next. This you're seeing a lot of these days. And this is even almost boomer esque, which is to shit on Gen Z and their love of cell phones. But hey, so glad I grew up, playing
Playing
in the
outside
wide,
doing this underneath the picture instead of
not that,
not this, and the picture is three preteen girls on their cell phones, not even looking at each other, looking at their phones. Share if you agree.
yeah.
Wow. This
And I will
this
say it's a conservative value, but I agree. How do you feel about this?
I don't know how to feel. I mean, I didn't have a cell phone until I graduated college.
Yeah.
And when I did get a cell phone, it wasn't a smartphone. It was the old style
I do
phone,
yet
Chris.
own a smart. You don't own an iPhone, do you?
I own an Android phone,
Right.
but it's a smartphone. But yeah,
Right,
I resisted owning a smartphone for a long time.
right. And I think most of our generation, what really gets us annoyed about when we look at young people today is that we played in the dirt and we experienced things, and it is frustrating to see how these kids fall. If you're a parent of a teenager and that was your childhood, I'm imagining this really resonates with you a lot. Next.
I'll just say about
Oh,
this. I don't know what the kids are doing on their phone, Chris. I mean, I think they could be making dance videos on TikTok sometimes, but I don't know.
I don't know. And
Kid,
it upsets
we
me.
should have a 13-year-old on here to explain what they're doing.
Yeah. And this is probably the get off my lawn humor that we're beginning to be known for as we reach middle age. Where we're like, now we're attacking young people and not boomers. Okay, next. Now, if we always hated the boomers, now we're at war with the millennials as well. So here's the guys and gals from the Breakfast Club sitting in detention, and it says, just remember, for every boomer that hates a millennial, there's a generation in between that hates you both. It's dark, it's angry, and it's honest. All right, next. And it's got breakfast now, and it's got Breakfast Club, which is iconic, right? Because we very much identify with the Breakfast Club, even though almost everybody, three of those people in that, the first three people, are now all 60. Only Anthony Michael Hall and Molly Ringwald are in their 50s. Next. This is from The Great Gatsby. It's Leonardo DiCaprio holding a champagne glass. There's like just a generically popular meme face, and it says, all the millennials and Gen Z kids think they have it bad dealing with the boomers. But here's to Gen X, who have been dealing with this shit for over 40 years. They did actually censor the shit part, I just realized.
Well, you have to do that on social media, okay?
Uh,
But you know what? That they even put that word in there. It's like that's very Gen X, right? Because we don't care
yeah,
about language, really.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's like I said earlier. It's like the boomers, they overshadow everything, and they always will. I think.
Yeah. Next, more Leonardo, and this is from Wolf of Wall Street, and more just piss and vinegar. On behalf of all Gen X, this millennial versus baby boomers narrative is exactly what my generation needed for entertainment. I mean, again, honest, true, hard, mean, nasty, and
I got. I gotta admit, I do like it. Like Kenan Thompson on a sketch of Saturday Night Live,
yeah.
like I think it was a Jeopardy sketch. He said something like they were talking about some kind of generational rift, and he said something like, "I'm Gen X. I'm just gonna sit here and enjoy the show."
Yeah, exactly. Well, go on to the next one stupid. Because you'll see. What? Go on. It's exactly what you said. Here's a scene from The Joker. It says, "Boomers versus millennials. Gen X just wants to watch the world burn." Which again speaks to the very nihilistic quality of Gen X.
Well, like I said earlier, Gen X, the slacker idea. I mean, I think we learned to temper our ambitions in life.
Yes, and it just really speaks to the fact that we have no expectations.
Exactly.
Next, I love this one. I'll tell you why. So it's Chris Pratt as Andy from Parks and Recreation, looking very doofusy. And it says, boomers, kids these days have no work ethic. Millennials, old people ruined everything. Gen Xer, I wonder if Rage Against the Machine reuniting will help me feel feelings again. And it's a good point, because we don't really we didn't even cover it much, but, the boomers and the silent generation in the 70s, they were so about their feelings all over the place that they really sucked up all the emotional air. And one of the things that we always talk about for Gen X is how we're ironically detached. It's so much about who we are. It's about emotional detachment and coping with our emotions. It's incredibly depressing and kind of almost speaks to almost like a depressive nature that belies our generation's wit.
Well, yeah, it's true. But, you learned in this forgotten generation that your feelings really didn't matter. It was like the boomers, they're the ones that mattered, and then they had kids, and now their kids matter. We never mattered, Chris.
Yeah, so go on to the next. I love this one. I mean, this is, again, it's part of the whole thing. So boomers are yelling at millennials are yelling at boomers. I know that Xena, who was yelling, but who's the blonde one?
Oh, I think that could be a shot from Popular or Bring It On, the cheerleader movie.
Right, so it has almost like a young person, old person generational fight. And there is one of the great boomer heroes of Gen X, right? There he is.
The Big Lebowski.
We love the dude. And what is he doing? He's just getting high. And it's interesting because I did talk about how we don't like drug humor is not as popular in our generation as it was, but I don't think it's so much about getting high as it's about, as you just said with that Kenan Thompson joke, it's about not even caring to get involved, right?
Well, that's part of the slacker mentality. Apathy is a reaction to the situation of not mattering and not being able to accomplish anything really. So yes.
Yeah. All right, so then the final one is just a variation, except it's Karen from Will and Grace having a lovely cocktail. Same concept. Honestly, same idea. I have to admit that's an amazing face that Megan Mullally is making. But it really does also just kind of says, like, we're so over you. We're no drama. We're just kind of a no drama generation. So just I want to talk a little bit about contemporary Gen X TV, where we're at now. And I'm thinking about shows like In Just Like That, which was the sequel to Sex and the City, which I did not like. Did you watch that?
No, I haven't seen it.
It's interesting because all the characters are in their 50s. They all talk about being in their 50s. The way that the millennials and Gen Z come out are very weird and horrible, which is a shame because I don't think you don't need to dump on them to make your point. And I didn't even really feel like these people have realistic lives. It really almost felt, again, like boomers writing for Gen X. I know originally it was boomers writing for Gen X when it was Sex in the City, and it just felt so inauthentic. But then like
There's definitely still a lot of baby boomers making culture, and there
right,
probably
whereas like
will for till they die.
I was watching Dead to Me with Christina Applegate and what is the one from Freaks and Geeks? I totally forgot her name. Anyway, she's a great actress, and the women are around the same age, and it takes place here in California, and their relationship and the way they that seemed very Gen X to me. Or a show like The Office has a very Gen X sensibility. Most of those characters would be around our age, and the way they look at office life.
Yeah, I got a great Gen X story about The Office. What's her
Yeah,
name? The female star of The Office played Pam.
yeah, Jenna Fisher.
Yeah, Jenna Fisher. So Jenna Fisher was like the big star, one of the big stars on The Office. She's beautiful. She described in an interview going to while The Office was on the air at its height, ratings height. She's describing going to some events with like different TV shows, and there's reporters, there's people taking pictures, there's a red carpet, and and everybody's getting all this attention except for the cast of The Office. and then a reporter comes up to her and is like, "Oh, what show are you folks on?" And she's like, "The Office." And the reporter, "Do you want to take a picture?" And she's like, "Nope," walks away.
But it's true. I mean, Linda Cardinelli was who I was thinking of before, but yeah, the Office actors, very Gen X. The outlook towards work is very Gen X. Michael Scott is probably my age on the show or close to it, and has like this weird Gen X, early '80s sensibility. It really shows how all the things our parents told us, or older brothers and older sisters told us about the working world, is just a big lie. That's really
they had a different experience. I mean,
yeah,
they grew up in the boom time. The '60s America was like a 10-year boom. I mean, it'll never come again.
and even like Parks and Recreation, which is a very Gen X show by the same people who do The Office, even if it's more upbeat and they're more idealistic and they're trying to do good still within that same Gen X world of diminished expectations, right? For all that Leslie Knope is trying to accomplish, and she's trying to accomplish a lot, and she's a good person, she still has to kind of deal with just the brutal reality of indifference, bureaucracy, and just having to constantly recalibrate her own dreams and ambitions. She's always running up head against, life and losing.
That sounds super Gen X to me, Chris.
Right. Probably the darkest version of that is BoJack Horseman, which is definitely a midlife crisis, obviously in animation. But our generation has always loved dark animation. Better Things with Pamela Alden features a great joke where her children accuse her of being a boomer, even though she is Gen X. So that drives her nuts. And it's a good show because it also addresses what it's like for our generation to be parents, which we don't have a lot of shows about. Certainly not a single parent, so that's a great show to watch. And then Ted Lasso, which again is probably the most popular show right now that you can watch with every generation. But Ted and the one who owns the football team, there's a lot of Gen Xers on that show, constantly making cultural references, dealing with their own what they're dealing with middle age, right? I mean, the key character is not the young footballers, but if you look at the Ted, you look at the coach, you look at the owner, you look at Hannah Waddington, who plays Rebecca, you look at Brendan Hunt, who plays Coach, who's also a writer on that show. Even I think Jake Goldstein's pretty close to being a Gen Xer. He's a millennial. But you see how they use pop cultural references, social references. What is it like to be a coach? It so bleeds some Gen X sensibility, but in a very subtle way. So, and we dominate the talk show right now. All the talk show hosts, Jimmy Fallon, James Corden, Stephen Colbert, who am I forgetting? The guy from Saturday Night Live.
You got him, Fallon, Colbert,
Corden, The one who used to do Weekend Update.
Uh, I'm
Seth
blanking.
Meyers.
Oh, Myers. Okay,
Right. So
right.
they're all Gen Xers now, right? Even the guys who do what's his face, John Oliver is a Gen Xer. Is Trevor Noah a Gen Xer or a millennial?
I'm not sure.
I think he's a millennial. But you really have a dominance. I think you've got one millennial in Trevor Noah and one boomer in Bill Maher.
Oh, Noah was born in '84, so he's
Oh,
arguably.
We're claiming Trevor Noah as Gen
We
X.
could claim him.
So really, basically, they're all basically Gen X or they're Bill Maher. And I will say the dark side of this is too, that one of the things that I love about our comedy is we're always not only are we self-deprecating, but always taking ourselves to task. And you can really see it a lot in like the comedy of Neil Brennan. You can see it with Marc Maron, who's admittedly a boomer, but just barely a boomer. But you see how we're willing to reevaluate. And I will say that a lot of the comedy that we grew up listening to, especially more of the boomer comedy, has not aged well, has it?
Well, specifically, what are you talking about?
Like the Monty Python stuff that is fairly racist and sexist. Jokes about drugs that we know about drugs are not
I
funny.
wouldn't even say, I would say Monty Python hasn't aged that well, but not just because of what you're talking about. I think it's just a lot of it just doesn't seem that good anymore. The movies are great though.
Right, I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying there's certain kind of things that are just unfunny. I mean, yes, there's individuals that are no longer funny. You can't watch Bill Cosby and really enjoy Bill Cosby anymore. I certainly can't even watch David Chappelle and enjoy David Chappelle anymore. But I'm not talking, or Louis C.K. I'm not even talking about the individuals, though we could. It's just that, I think so much of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were so focused on being irreverent that no one really stopped to think, maybe we were also punching down. And I know a lot of people are like, oh man, you can't say anything today. Bullshit. You can always be funny and you can always say stuff. It's just don't punch down.
Well,
don't be sexist. Don't be racist. Don't be misogynist. Don't look at a group of people who are suffering and go, hey, that's a group ripe for comedy.
Well, let me just say something. I think a lot of the boomers thought they were doing something and they weren't really doing it. Okay, because I got a story about Saturday Night Live. So Saturday Night Live, when it started, everybody on Saturday Night Live thought, oh, we're doing this fresh, new, irreverent sketch comedy. We're cutting edge. We're counterculture and all this. And they even had Milton Berle on as a host one time, and the cast immediately were disgusted by the idea because Milton Berle represented like the old culture, okay? And the thing is, though, is Milton Berle, for years did the top sketch comedy show. Well, it was a variety show, but he did sketch comedy on his show. He did that show for years in America in like the 50s, and the people Saturday Night Live didn't like that. But here's the irony: is the cast of Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live is just an old-timey variety show, like from the Milton Berle era. I mean, they're doing the same show that Milton Berle did, but they think they're doing something fresh and original. And so I think you see this a lot with the baby boomers. They think they're irreverent. They think they're fresh and original. They think they're being countercultural, but they're not really. And you see that over and over. I mean, you see that in Monty Python, like you're talking about. You see it a lot.
A lot of our influences, Woody Allen. You got to reevaluate. But on the other hand, also, I did just see Janeane Garofalo about a year ago in New York doing the same Notebook thing, and she was terrible. She was really just terrible. She accused me of being a Republican. I wanted to say I'm not a Republican. I just don't think you're funny. She said, I don't have any jokes. I just have observations. And her observations were kind of really cruel on younger people. And they weren't jokes, and she just kind of lost it. And quite a few of every generation, just like our music stars can sometimes start to suck, many of our funniest people aren't really very funny anymore. Some are. And, I think some of Patton Oswalt and Chris Rock are just doing great stuff right now. And I'd like to include more women, and that's Sarah Silverman, I think, is 10 times more interesting today than she's ever been. And I have a feeling that what you're going to start seeing at middle age is the comics who really always had something very honest and profound to say, who are willing to take themselves to task and be truth tellers. I think they're going to continue to have careers into old age. And I think the comics who are just coasting on irreverency for irreverency's sake, I think they're going to start to pass off to the younger generation that can own irreverency. Because I think, if you're being honest, the younger generation is always going to be the most irreverent generation because they have no allegiance to past beliefs and norms.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you a question. What do you think? Do you
Yeah.
have any conception of what the next generation's culture comedy will be like?
No, and I don't even think I'd be capable of doing it because I can only work within the limitations of my Gen X sensibility. That's the other downside, is that just like I can't really appreciate new music, and I go to comedy clubs and I'm still trying my way in stand up. But as I get older, I find young people's comedy less funny. Not because they're not funny. I can understand intellectually that it's funny stuff. It's just where they're at in their lives. Is a place. It's been such a long time that I've been in that same place that it's funny, but it's not super funny because I've already been there, man. I've already had that experience. I've already had the first date, the jobs. So I think, I was thinking of Don Rickles, Bob Newhart, Phyllis Diller, Joan Rivers, and these were comics who had followings long past their own generation, right until they outlived their own followers. They had new fans. And I think the thing that distinguished all of them were, at day's end, they were always very honest about their own failings. They were always very Dangerfield. They were always very honest about what they saw and felt, and they were willing to move with the times. And I really do feel like the best of us, the best of the funny people, the Mel Brookses, whoever, are the ones who are less resistant to change. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the great stand-ups, they seem to be able, the great comics, they seem to be able to move with the times. Yeah, I mean, I can't say it any better.
Yeah, so I guess as the future, which we don't know, and sadly we're losing a lot of our funny people unexpectedly. I can't say I know what's going to happen either in film or TV. I would guess that comedy really, the story of comedy always comes in two stages. As I said at the beginning, there's a comedy of being young and everything being new, and then there's a comedy of middle age being old, which is having been around a long time and watching things you love and care about, like your body and all the other things. It's just watching them fade away. So I'm not saying or that it's depressing. It's not. It's just those are the two stages of comedy, and we are now clearly we have always been we have always been a precocious. Gen X comedy has always been precocious, right? We started out as Danny Bonaduce or the girls from Facts of Life or Arnold Drummond. We've always not Arnold. We've not Drummond. Arnold. We've always started out as these middle-aged people in the bodies of adolescents, and I think we've now come full circle. And I honestly believe we are now adolescents going through a second adolescence in the diminishing bodies of a middle-aged person. And in some sense, maybe Gen X comedy is going to be at its best now because we've never been that concerned about being young. We've only really been, our concerns have historically really been middle-aged people concerns. So maybe it's possible. And Chris Rock might be example, proof positive that this might even be a renaissance and a great time because as we deal with these issues, we will get to even new and more exciting truths. So I'm very excited to see what the next Wes Anderson, Noah Baumbach, or female director, or Amy Schumer, whatever these people are going to put out, and how are our best and brightest, our funniest, creative most people are going to deal with middle age. I really pray that they're going to hang on like previous generations to just being young, because one of the things that we've always had contempt for was how the previous generations did hang on to being young. I hope we embrace our age with all the irony and sarcasm that we are known for. Any last words, Randall?
Well, I just look forward to see what these new generations will come up with because, yeah, these internet connected kids always on their phones, always with a fractured cultural ecosystem. that they're growing up in. I think it's going to be a fascinating time for art and culture.
Well, I wish them all the best on their journey, as I'm just going to focus on our generation because just like in 30 years ago when I saw young Janeane Garofalo speak to me in my moment in time, I desperately love when I can watch a movie, a TV show, or a comic addressing what it's like to be 56 in the year 2022. And on that note, thank you guys. This was a long one, but I had a lot to say. I almost seem to always do with comedy. So until next time, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Bye.